When you got into the business, it was very, very protected. How did the boys treat you at first?
They were guarded at first. I did a radio show called Inside Wrestling, the radio show the radio magazine show for pro wrestling fans. And now here's what's happening, baby. That was the name of my column. So I started that at Sunnyside Garden in Queens, and
Nice.
the guys knew I had a radio show. So Oscar Keneal and Mike Rosenberg were the promoters, and they invited me down one time to do some wrestling interviews. And I remember I'm meeting Bruno down there, not Sammartino, Bruno Schwartz. He was one of, no, Bruno Sammartino, um, Strongbow, Gorilla Monsoon. And Gorilla Monsoon told me, he asked me, who do you work for? And I said, I'm representing the magazines. And I mentioned to him that I worked for, this was in the early 70s, not in the mid 60s. I mentioned I worked for Mr. Weston, and he and Mr. Weston didn't get along for an article that was written that he didn't like. But he said, you seem to be a nice guy, and we'll watch you and see what happens. Through that, I met Vince Sr. at some of the TV tapings. And he also didn't like Mr. Weston because of some of the things that were written in the magazines. You know, why a rapist invaded my dressing room. There we go back to print bait again.
Right.
But they gave me a chance. And I remember Bruno saying to me that he read his life story that Mr. Weston wrote in the magazines. And he said he was embarrassed, and his friends were embarrassed, where they talked about his 5-year-old sister killing a Nazi with a gun. And so I said, wait. I went back to Mr. Weston. He said to me the next day, it's a great story. I said, but it's someone's personal story. So he let me do what became the very first shoot interview in the magazines. And it came out on the cover. Bruno Sammartino tells it like it is.
Oh, wow.
The real life story of Bruno Sammartino. And that started getting the steam rolling. And there were guys who wanted to be at that point. I was still doing the radio show. I was buying my own time on WHBI 105.9 FM in New York. It's like $30 for an hour during drive time. It was wonderful. And I was interviewing guys, and they wanted to be on the radio too. So yeah, and then they started letting me get into Madison Square Garden. And back then, if you were backstage, Lou Albano, Fred Lassie, the Grand Wizard, they were all stick backstage and all that. But when Vince Sr. and Willie Gilsenberg and others were discussing business, I was never allowed to hear or see part of it.
Right.
Once in a while I did, and I think they were testing me because I never broke what was back then kayfabe. And after a while, the various promoters, when I would go to the territories, they knew that, and it was a great thing while we were doing the magazines that some of the trips I went on, you know, some of the promoters like Jim Crockett um, said, "Well, this guy can talk and he looks professional." I always wore a shirt and tie when I had a full head of hair. And they'd start to put me on TV to give local awards like Vern Gagne let me do. So little by little, I started to get a following, and I was getting mail in the office. And Mr. Weston was like, "These people know who you are." So that's how the original started out. But yeah, to build up a trust, there were a few guys back in the day like Bulldog Brower, who for some reason just didn't trust me for a few years, and because he never broke character
Hmm.
backstage, never broke character. Um, but I think my closest confidant back then was Bruno Sammartino. We exchanged phone numbers, and sometimes he'd call me 2 o'clock in the morning on a regular telephone. People don't know what this means anymore. And 2 in the morning would be, "Hey,
He wouldn't
honey,
text you, Bill?
what's that?
He wouldn't text you?
On what?" And so he would test me. Uh, and he'd call me like 1 o'clock in the morning when he'd get home. He was in Pittsburgh and I was in in Queens where I lived, and he just want to shoot the breeze and talk about the magazines and stuff. And we became really close. So I attribute a lot of what I became in the open door policy to him. Down in it was territory by territory. Jim Crockett appreciated um, the promotion in the magazines. And when the magazines eventually, the WWE, WWF back then banned all of the magazines from shooting pictures because they had their own magazine,
Right.
we made Crockett's people bigger on the cover, and we got a TV deal out of that. I was doing PWI scouting reports every week on TBS. Vern Gagne then invited me down to do the scouting reports or press conferences on his TV. So little by little, the guys saw that if the promoters are having me come down there, this guy's okay. And then a lot of the guys would tell me what was going to happen in a match, and I never repeated it to anyone. I know my dad, who was my closest father, right? I only had one. Um, Back when Bruno Sammartino was going to lose the belt to Ivan Koloff at the Garden, the biggest title change in history back then. Mr. Weston called me into his office and he said, I'm going to tell you something, and you've never heard this. And if you mention it to anyone, I didn't tell you. I got a call. That's what he sounded like. I got a call from Willie Gilsenberg. Make sure you have a lot of film in the camera tonight.
Wow.
And I figured out immediately what was going to happen. And my dad went with me every once a month on Monday nights to the Garden, and they let him sit in the press section with me, and I never told him. So
What was
that's
that?
that. And today, sometimes I'm still very protective of the business. People will reveal, if the wrestlers reveal it now. We're an episodic soap opera, but
Right.
sometimes I defend it. Still, it's old school habit. What can I tell you?
Bill, what was that moment like when Bruno lost the belt? Being there live. What was that
It was
like?
dead silence. 21,000 people at Madison Square Garden. I'm having too many hip cracks, as Teddy Long calls it. 21,000 at the people at the Garden, dead silence. Made the cover of the New York Daily News the next day. That's how
Wow.
strong that was. People were crying. I remember Georgianne Macropolis, his fan club president, sitting in the front row, hysterical crying, because nobody knew. There were very
Right.
few of us who knew about it.